Well, friends, once again, many thanks for joining us this evening for the fireside. As we're all seeing, there's a lot going on in the world, and it seems that perhaps the pandemic is compressing the issues the world is engulfed in and underscoring the fundamental challenges we seem to have with overcoming deeply rooted causes of our difficulties. So, the theme this evening is the fundamental challenges of our times and solutions for transformation. We're really happy to have Dr. Robert Henderson with us this evening to share his perspectives. Dr. Henderson is the founder of the Henderson Consulting Group. A large part of his work is around organizational development and change management. He has served an extensive array of clients, including corporate, civic society, justice system, local governments, and more. His clients have included American Express, General Electric, Prudential, and the Chicago White Sox. He serves on the board of the First Bank and Trust of Illinois. He was also co-founder of Air Atlanta, the first commercial jet airline owned by African Americans. He has worked extensively with communities and organizations in the areas of race unity, ethnic bias, and diversity. He has also spoken at the White House Conference on Race. Dr. Henderson earned a doctoral degree in education from the University of Massachusetts. He is currently a member of the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States, which is the national governing body of the American Baha'i community. So, on behalf of everyone, I'd like to welcome Dr. Robert Bob Henderson.
I'm delighted to join you and uh, Vava. When we spoke before, you were talking about trying to make sense out of a world that is strangely chaotic and seems to be crumbling in front of our very eyes. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the drivers of what is the fundamental reorganization of the world as we know it, and ways that we might understand some of these things. And let me start by just suggesting a couple of things. The first is there was a thinker in the 20th century who, to my mind, was one of the most profound contributors to the understanding of modern life in the 20th century. His name was Peter Drucker. And many of you may not know him, but he is the person who defined all of the fundamental principles and practices of management and leadership as we know it. He was an economist and a sociologist and a profound thinker. And toward the end of his life, he wrote a book called Post-Capitalist Society. And what the book was about was the importance of knowledge over money in driving social development and social change. And here's what he said in the book, to be just to summarize a pretty important book in a few short words. The first thing he said was that every 500 to 1,000 years, civilization is revolutionized with a dramatic leap forward in knowledge. And everything changes: art, architecture, literature, law, philosophy, mathematics, science, the structure of society, and the role and relationship of people in societies change. He said that the last time this revolutionary change occurred was in the middle 1850s. And he said that the primary characteristic of that change was an explosion of knowledge. He said that knowledge was first applied to how we work. It was secondly applied to how we organize organizations and management structures and corporations and the like. And he said third, that knowledge was applied to itself. And he said that when knowledge was applied to knowledge, everything exploded. And so suddenly we have this profusion of science and art and architecture and technology that is proceeding at a speed that no one has ever seen before. In fact, it is proceeding so fast that in technological terms, what we know about technology doubles every 2 years. And this year, for the first time in human history, what we know about everything will double at the end of every year. In medical science, knowledge is doubling so fast that vast computers are needed in medical schools just to keep track of the proliferation of medical studies and insights and new practices that help us understand what we are learning about how the human body is assembled, how it works, and what happens when it's diseased. Now, interestingly, Drucker's insight corresponds specifically to what I believe is a Baha'i, that every 500 to 1,000 years there has been a tremendous impulse in the advance of human civilization. And we believe that these impulses were driven by messengers of God who provided knowledge and law and social organization guidelines and a new spirit, which energized the spirit of humankind and it propelled them forward. And we believe that the last time this happened was indeed in the 1850s with the coming of Baha'u'llah. So what we want to take a few minutes of your time with this evening is to talk about how that change, how that impulse is affecting the reorganization of the world. What it is, how it's working, and the transformational effects that it's having on the world. We want to talk about some of the fundamental underpinnings of that. And we want to talk about different ways of understanding. Somehow I got muted. I'm not exactly sure how that happened, but my computer told me, you're making noise, but nobody can hear you. But let me just set the scene for a second. We all know about the ravaging effects of the coronavirus. We all know about the racial unrest in the United States, but truly that's reflective of a global pattern of change that we'll talk a little bit more about later. And third, we know about the transformational effects of climate change. And when we take all these things together, we find ourselves in a truly chaotic situation. And so I want to suggest a couple of things to you. The first thing that I want to suggest is that chaos is not the collapse of order. Chaos is not just the willy-nilly distribution of random events that confuse us. So physicists define chaos as the transformation of a lower level of order to a higher level of order. But the transformation itself is turbulent. And so when we think about the disturbing effects of all the things that are going on, and we have legitimate worries in every case, the coronavirus, the epicenter of which I live in, racial unrest, which is my lived experience, and climate change, which is affecting all of us, are going to change virtually every aspect of civil society, not just in the Americas, but all over the world. And so let's just take a look at how that's working. And I'd like to use 3 stories to make some points. And what I'll do is I'll tell you these stories as a way of highlighting some of the primary features of this chaotic transition from one level of social order to a higher level of social order. And then I'll try and unpack some of the principles. And then, as Vafa advised me, this is really a conversation. So I'll try not to be too dominant, but to set up some fun things for us to talk about. And perhaps we can have some questions and some observations by many of us, and just deepen our understanding of what's happening. The first story I'd like to tell is going to be about the issue of race. And the reason that I want to tell this story first is because I think that one of the underlying principles of all three of these cases, the coronavirus, racial injustice, and climate change, has to do with the understanding that Baha'is call the oneness of humankind. And that is, as Baha'is understand, not simply the reawakening of the spirit of brotherhood, but a fundamental principle that has to be applied to every aspect of our lives, our trade and finance, the organization and function of our social institutions, the political structures that we use to govern ourselves and to minister to the needs of our communities, and every other aspect of human life. So I want to start with this story because I think it makes some fundamental points about the dilemmas we're in and about some of the ways that we can understand and manage these dilemmas. And I'd like to suggest, before I tell the story, that the racial injustice that is being protested against, not just in the United States, but all over the world, is a real reality. I don't know an African American person, including myself, that has not been subject to the devastating effects of discrimination, of racial injustice, of injustice with the police, and so forth. In fact, just to put this into perspective, I remember when my youngest son, who is now an attorney and has children of his own, was 9 years old, and he was riding his bicycle in our neighborhood. And he was stopped by the police, who accused him of stealing the bicycle. Now, this is his bike, and he's riding it like any 9-year-old child does in the neighborhood. And when my son Miles told the police officer where he lived, the response of the police officer was, "That's not possible." Because in the mind of the police officer, a 9-year-old black boy couldn't live in that neighborhood, in that house. And the only way that he was able to extricate himself from this difficult situation was to ask the police officer if he knew another officer. And the police officer said, "Well, how do you know this policeman?" And he said, "Well, he comes to our school in Wilmette, Illinois, and he tells the kids that we should be law-abiding and that we shouldn't involve ourselves with drugs or cigarettes or anything else." And then the officer realized that my son Miles was telling the truth. But this is just a mild story of the daily life of African Americans. So let's not assume that these protests are somehow inflated with concerns that are less than legitimate. But at the same time, let's ask ourselves, what are we learning about unity? What are we learning about how unity works, what it is, and the effects that it can have in transforming our social institutions? So let me tell you a story about the Bahia Vista School in San Rafael, California. Now, San Rafael is paradise. It is as pretty as any place could possibly be. All the houses cost more than I can afford, and the neighborhoods are gorgeous. And it is right next to the Imperial Valley, where most of the food we eat comes from. So at some point, the school district decided that the children of migrant laborers should go to the San Rafael schools because they were right next to each other. And when the children came and they integrated the school, suddenly the school had kids that spoke 27 different languages and came from as many different countries as you can imagine. Well, you can imagine that the schools were as completely chaotic as I described. I mean, there was virtually no child who could understand any other child. And the teachers spoke one of the 27 languages, but not the others. Now, I was there as a member of a team board of visitors. looking after money that had been invested in the school, because the school decided that what it would do is develop an English as a second language program in order to facilitate communication among the teachers and among the children. And so they did that. And we were visiting after about 5 years of the operation of this program. And I interviewed the teachers, and we talked to the principal, and we visited the classes and so forth. And they just told us bizarre stories of complete frustration of what it was like when you have kids in one classroom that spoke 27 different languages. But now, as we looked at the kids, we found some very interesting things. First, we found that the parents, the rich parents who were overwhelmingly white and who had opposed the integration of their schools, saying that their tax dollars weren't paying for these immigrant kids to come to these elite schools. So these kids should have a school of their own, paid for by their parents, but not by our tax dollars. But now we find that when we go into the classrooms, we can't tell who the teacher is, because there are several adults in every classroom, and some of the adults are the parents of the immigrant children, and some of the adults are the parents of the resident children, of the permanent resident children. The second thing we found was that after a few years, the kids developed conversational capacity in at least 3 languages. And by the time they were in 6th grade, they were conversational, if not fluent, in 4 languages. The fourth thing we found was that not only were the kids now multilingual and multicultural, but they were all testing at the very top of the California State reading, writing, and mathematics examinations. So when they took the state exams as elementary kids, their average test scores were above the 90% level. So here you have these classrooms that are now perfectly integrated with kids from 27 different countries who now speak at least 4 languages, who are reading, writing, and calculating better than almost every kid in California, and whose parents are actively involved in their education. The second thing that we learned was that in the process of figuring out how to unify this incredibly diverse school population, the teachers had created new kinds of programs. One was a peer mediation program where they had taught the kids how to mediate disputes and conflicts among other kids. They taught them peer mediation, they taught them the rudiments of consultation, they taught them how to calm down situations and so forth. And these are 6, 7, 8, and 9-year-olds who are peer mediators among an incredibly diverse population of kids from 27 different countries, rich kids and poor kids in the same environment. The second thing that we found was that the school had initiated a program which they called metacognition. Now, metacognition is probably not something that we know about, but it's something that these 6, 7, 8, and 9, and 10-year-old kids know about. And what metacognition is learning to think about thinking. That's what it is. You learn to think about thinking. And the way the kids use it is to manage their inner discourse. So, for example, a kid comes into the classroom from recess, and they're all excited, and they're sweating, and their energy is up, and they've just been playing. And what metacognition allows them to do is to say, all right, I was at recess, but now I'm back into the classroom. So I need to shift my cognitive gears, and I need to begin to focus on my academic work. And when a 6-year-old has that kind of vocabulary and that kind of self-control, you've just got to marvel. And the last program that they did that I want to talk about is they created a program called Every Student is a Leader. And the idea was that leadership is the influence that one person has over another. And since we're all interconnected and we all have responsibility for the range of our social relationships, every child has to assume some responsibility for her or his behavior as it influences the behavior and the condition and the happiness of other kids. Well, you can imagine, I mean, this is amazing. So we're walking around and here these kids are, and you can imagine walking into a classroom, and in one case, one child switches from French to Spanish to English while talking to other kids. One child starts to speak in Chinese, another in Vietnamese, and clusters of kids huddle around them as they want to understand what's being said. In the earlier grades, the teachers had become aware of the need to let the children self-organize. So in kindergarten and first grade, as the kids are acquiring a common language, one of the things that the teachers became comfortable with is the kind of chaos of that situation, because the way the kids would communicate is they would pantomime. They would act out what they were trying to do and what they were trying to say, and piece that together with a little bit of language. The second thing that they learned was the second language the kids learned wasn't necessarily English. It was the language of their best friend. But very quickly, it turned into my own language, then the language of my best friend, and then English. And in the process, you can imagine what terrific problem solvers these kids were. Their enhanced ability to communicate with kids from a wide diversity of backgrounds and to understand their importance as human beings, their values, the way they thought, the things they thought were important, and so on. And you can imagine how much fun it was for one of these kids to learn the different languages of all their friends. So I asked one of the kids, I said, you know, you're so good at speaking the different languages in the schools. Which language is your favorite? Because your accent sounds so authentic in every one of the languages. When you speak English, it's perfect. When you speak Spanish, it's perfect. So I asked the child, which language is your favorite? And this was a 7-year-old, I might add. And without hesitation, the child said Chinese. I said, Chinese? I mean, that's just crazy. Why Chinese? And the little boy looked at me and he said, because it's the most fun. Can you imagine? Now tell me you don't want your kids to go to that school. But what we learn from this is that this is really the antidote to virtually every concern we have as a world. Because here in this little classroom, in this dramatic collision between extraordinary wealth and extraordinary poverty, where you have virtually nothing in common. They didn't have political alignment, they didn't have social alignment, they didn't agree on the fundamentals of human value, and yet they were able to take a learning approach and to patiently implement a process which allowed these kids to become super kids. And so as I looked around and I saw the poster that represents the school, one of the most fun things is that the poster is of a skinny-armed 8-year-old with a Superman's cape, arms extended as if he's flying through the air and capable of leaping tall buildings in a single bound. Well, you can imagine that if that's possible, where there's no political agreement, where there is real concern that I'm being financially cheated, that's exactly what the rich parents thought, where they thought that the academic and social development of their children would be hindered by the presence of the kids from 27 different countries. And yet they were able to learn sufficient amount to create an extraordinary unity, not only among the kids, but among the parents as well. And to become one of the leading schools, not just in California, but all over the country. And here's the point that I wanted to make, that fundamentally, as the world is contracting into a neighborhood, and as populations of human beings from Africa, from South America, from Asia are beginning to wander all over the earth and become citizens and residents of new countries. We are confronted with this very same challenge on a global basis. And if we are able to adopt this view that all human beings have a divinely infused equal value as people, and if we are able to tolerate and find ways to navigate this chaotic evolution from one level of social organization, which is us in our little cubbyholes, whether our cubbyholes are nations or communities or neighborhoods, to learning about what it's like to be together and to learn one another's languages and to learn one another's cultures and to begin to develop understandings that will allow us to communicate and relate to one another on a brand new level, then we can achieve some of the same outstanding outcomes that the Bahia Vista School achieved. Now, let me just note that the neuroscientists who study the value of diversity have told us some things that we absolutely didn't know. For example, diverse groups of problem solvers, when they have general relevant knowledge, are better at problem solving than experts in the very same area. Not only are they consistently better, but the bigger the problem, the better they do. But the key is that they have a consultative approach. Everybody gets heard, nobody gets dismissed, ideas are welcome, and they take a tolerant approach to the development of understandings that relate to an out-of-the-box solution to whatever problem they're solving. As a result, companies like American Express, like General Electric, like Google, like Intel, like major hospitals and so forth, those companies that have diverse leadership and diverse membership in the organization not only perform better and solve more problems, they make more money. And they don't make a little bit more money. They have a 35% greater opportunity to be profitable than companies without. So in every way, just like the kids at the Bahia Vista School, you have this transformation. But what are the requirements of this transformation? Well, one of the requirements is that you have to get comfortable with that chaotic process of transition. That you have to know that we are leaving one stage of our development. And we're not just floating wildly through the ether. We're actually growing to another stage of our development. The way I like to think about it is with my young son, Miles. I remember when he was 10 years old, he wanted a very expensive pair of basketball shoes. And I thought to myself, well, you know, for crying out loud, sports is the kid's life. Let's go deep and buy these basketball shoes. 2 months later, and so, you know, so I did what every parent does. I bought the shoes with a lot of room to spare so they would last him through the summer and into school. And that's what we all want. We want to save money, but we want to get the kids what they want. A month later, he says, "Dad, my shoes hurt." And I say, "Miles, that's just not possible." But I pinched his toe, and sure enough, his foot had grown to the limit of the shoe. So I bought him another pair of shoes, and a month later, they were too small, and I bought him another pair of shoes, and a month later, they were too small. And by July, this kid was still not 5 feet tall, but his arms were down to his knees. His feet were as long as his body, And no matter when he showered, his hormones were waking up, and when he walked through the room, you could tell. That's just what happens. That's the chaotic process of going from one level of order to another level of order. Now he's 6'2", and he's handsome, and he's a good husband and a good father and a good attorney. And we're all very pleased and grateful. But there was that one point where he was just going through puberty, and everything was exploding at once. And I told myself the same thing that all of us who've had kids tell ourselves. This is a necessary and beneficial stage in our development, in the development of our children. And so what I'm asking you to do is to think about the change that we're going through as a world in the very same terms. Yes, we are growing out of our shoes. Our institutions don't serve us well. The social understandings and the social order that we've relied on for so long is falling apart for us. But we are not simply collapsing. We are actually transitioning to a much higher level of social order. And I'll tell you what the characteristics are. The first is that we are learning that as human beings, we have to have an independent search for truth. We have to know of our own knowledge and not of the knowledge of anybody else. And one of the reasons for this is that if we go by somebody else's definition or by old definitions, we're likely to be misled. Because as I said, knowledge is growing so fast and things are changing so fast that we have to be active learners throughout our lives. The second is that we have to suspend our judgment about the equality and the quality of other human beings. We have to say to ourselves, imagine a world where women are fully participant in every aspect of life and exert leadership and influence on every aspect of life. And where this is happening, life is changing. I'll tell you a story about that in a second. We have to banish every aspect of racial discrimination and cultural discrimination and class discrimination because of this commitment to the idea that humankind is fundamentally one thing, that all human beings are fundamentally equal. This is a brand new idea. This was not an idea 200 years ago, but it is the foundation of current reality. And we have to push education as quickly and as fast and as far as we can. Now, you say, well, Bob, all of that is great, but I just don't see any of that happening in the current world. And I would say to you, let's look again. Because if we ask ourselves, for example, I can see most of you, not everybody, but I can see most of you. How many of you, just raise your hands, how many of you think that extreme poverty in the world is getting worse? Raise your hand. All right. How many of you think that extreme poverty in the world is getting better? That is, there's less of it now than there used to be. Okay. How many of you think that the standard of education of women in the world is still a crippling challenge, and that in those areas of extreme poverty, women do not have access to education that would allow them to improve their lives? How many of you think that? Okay. So most of you think that extreme poverty is worse, and most of you think that women are not being educated, and especially in those areas of extreme poverty. So think about this. Now I can see your faces, and I can judge about when we were all born. So I'll say it like this. When you were born, the percentage of the world's population that lived in extreme poverty was about 85%. Today, The percentage of the world's population that lives in extreme poverty is 9%. When you were born, there were two social realities globally. There was the developed world that had all the money and the social education and the social institutions, and the developing world, which was largely characterized by poverty. Today, 74% of the world's population lives in the middle, where they are out of extreme poverty. They are able to buy bicycles, able to take a holiday, able to educate their children, and so on. Today, for example, infant mortality has dropped in the last 20 years by 75%. You know why? Because 80% of the world's population of children is vaccinated. Just that simple. Today, all of the projects that we've had on water purification, on educating women and men, let's go back to the education point. I asked you how many women are educated. Globally, in the developing world, the average degree of education is 9 years, 9th grade. And the result of that is they are better able to care for their families. They have fewer children. For example, when you were born, in the quote developing world, women averaged about 5 to 6 kids per mother. Now it's 2.5. And one of the reasons for that is women are being educated more, they are working sooner in life, and they are having children later in life. And they are able to depend on medical care and education and a variety of other things to keep those children alive and to make sure that those children prosper. So all of the concern that we had about global overpopulation, when you were born, we thought that the world would be vastly overpopulated, the cities would be choked with people that it couldn't accommodate, and it would create an ecological disaster and a social disaster. Today, the global population studies tell us that the global population will peak at about 10.5 billion people and then steadily decline. So this whole idea of an overcrowded world, it's not going to happen. It's simply not going to happen. When we look at issues like climate change, when you were born, not only was the world locked in extreme poverty, and not only were women not educated, but the world was largely tribal. In the United States, it was tribal by neighborhood. You lived in white neighborhoods or black neighborhoods or Chicano neighborhoods or Asian neighborhoods, but you didn't live in integrated neighborhoods. And that was true of most countries. But today, not only is immigration a global phenomenon, but it's bringing about transformational change that will affect our social organization, our intercultural understanding and interracial understanding, and it will affect climate change. Let me give you an example. Let me see the hands of everybody who's heard of the Great Green Wall. Anybody heard of the Great Green Wall? All right, I see one hand. Oh, 2 hands. Okay, I see 2 hands. The Great Green Wall, 3 hands, is a forest that is being built across the Sahara Desert on the continent of Africa. And the idea of this forest is to stop the African continent from turning into a desert, because deserts expand. What the Great Green Wall is doing is not only changing the climate, it's allowing greater water retention, it's allowing the development of agriculture, it's creating jobs, it is causing more rainfall, and it is stretching now through 23 different countries across the fat part of the bottom of the Sahara Desert in the biggest, widest part of Africa. And what it's doing is it is taking countries who historically haven't been nation states as we understand them. They're really confederations of tribes. So we say it's this country or that country, but what it really is a collection of tribes, and they have a government of this kind or that kind. But what's happening in the construction of the Great Green Wall is that these tribes are working together to transform the social and agricultural and climate aspects of their nations. And in the process, they're getting to know each other. And they are becoming real nations. And not only are they becoming real nations, but they're actually cooperating with other nations. So it's super accelerating this process of nation building. Well, what are some of the other advantages? Well, one of the advantages is that women are being hired to grow all kinds of related industries. Another advantage is schools are being developed all over the place. I mean, for example, in Tanzania, President Kikwete, with whom I worked closely, developed a plan to build 5,000 schools in Tanzania so that 100% of Tanzanian children could go to school. And so he pitched this idea to the country, and the country said, this is our way to development. The countrymen themselves got involved, and they, instead of building 5,000 schools in 10 years, they built 5,000 schools in 3 years. And they built those schools so fast that they didn't have teachers to fill them. And so we did some other things, which I don't know that we'll have to have time to talk about, but they're fun and they work. But you see my point, that even with climate change, there are these revolutionary things occurring that are transforming the social condition, the economic development, the education level, the escape from extreme poverty, and the transformation of the climate itself. All right, so one last point. The idea that the world is, well, let me just ask you, how many of you think that the world is more dangerous now than it was when you were a child? All right, so I see some hands, but not a lot of hands, and I think you all are catching on to me. I think you okay. All right, so long story short, here's the deal. Studies of violence worldwide are generally calculated by the number of violent deaths per 100,000 people. So an easy way to think about this is that in World War II, there were about 700 violent deaths per 100,000 people. You know what it is now? 0.03. 0.03. In every aspect of life, terrorist violence, violence against women, violence against children, murder, mayhem, every kind of violence you can measure is less, dramatically less. I'll give you an example. In ghettos in the United States, in the 1950s, which people tend to talk about as a safe time, a child today in the same place is 11 times safer than they were in 1955. And another way to think about this is that in the United States, there are 50 million children. Of those 50 million children, there is an extraordinary and legitimate concern about kids being safe, and especially about kids not being kidnapped. But among those 50 million kids, the number of kids that are kidnapped by bad guys every year is less than 100 out of 50 million kids. If a child is taken, it's by a parent, not by some person who means to steal your child. So my point is that in every aspect of life, and I've just given you 3 examples, but I could give you hundreds, we could show that violence in violent-ridden neighborhoods is being reduced by the power of unity. We can show that the entrance of women in schools and in the workforce are transforming societies and workplaces. We can show that every major problem, from climate to race to the ravages of poverty, are being solved. And yet this is not what you hear or what you read about in the news. So let me give you one last example. In Taiwan, they have a Center for Disease Control. This center manages the response of the Taiwanese government to potential pandemic outbreaks. They had been hit hard by the SARS epidemic, and they had decided that they would prepare an emergency response capacity so that if a pandemic occurred again, they would be ready. A team of Taiwanese epidemiologists saw some suspicious activity in the Wuhan province in China, got the permission from the Chinese government to go to Wuhan and investigate, and saw 6 cases they didn't like. And they came back and rightly diagnosed that there was a novel coronavirus that was likely to explode and spread. And so they created a social organization. They created contact tracing through cell phones. They developed social protocols and policies that they held people accountable for, because they realized that if China had a pandemic explosion, it would wipe out Taiwan. Virtually, they would simply have no defenses. Everywhere that has been done, in New Zealand, in Greece, belatedly in Italy, and in Canada, where efforts have been coordinated, where the people have gotten accurate information, when there has been a compassionate, cooperative approach, but very clear guidelines for people to use to work together, the coronavirus is being, that curve is being flattened, and the number of new cases is being diminished. If you look at the case of the United States, we have 77,000 new cases. 2 weeks ago, it was 50,000 new cases a day. God knows what it'll be in a month, but here we have no resolution about should we wear masks or not, should we open the economy or keep it closed. And what's confusing us and what's defeating us is our inability to work together. All right, so I've told you these stories, and now I just want to draw a circle around some of the fundamental and spiritual principles that they all have in common. The first is a growing recognition of the oneness of humankind. This idea that God created all of us, and that all of us are important, and that our mission today is to learn about one another and to build a society that is integrated, cooperative, and unified. The second common denominator is a revolution in the role of women. In every one of the cases that I described, women have played a primary role in transforming the education of children, the operation of social life, social institutions, businesses, and the like, and in the setting of policies at every level, local to national. For example, it was a woman in a village in Ghana who established the idea that we should put these big boxes about the size of a small room in Ghanaian villages. And in the boxes would be the equipment to fix bicycles and small motors and cell phone technology. And then to train young people to run those businesses and to provide money for themselves and for their families. And the cell phone technology allowed them to connect to distant doctors remotely and get medical assistance. Well, the difference this made was that then when the farmers harvested their crops, they didn't have to guess which market to go to. They could call around and find which market was paying the most for the crops they had to sell. The result of that was that a farmer could buy a new cow, which revolutionized that farmer's standard of living and the standard of living for their parent, for their family. The second result was organizations of women, clusters of women, started renting trucks, a truck and then several trucks, to carry their crops to market. The third revolution was that women organized to buy those trucks they rented and to sell their services to various farmers. And gradually, regional organizations sprung up that increased the level of life and the financial security of whole regions, as well as bringing them together. Well, what did they do with their extra money? Well, they bought goats and they bought cows. But the other thing that they did was they had a systematic campaign to hire a teacher for the village and a systematic campaign to hire a nurse for the village. And gradually you see this movement out of poverty. Well, you might be saying to yourself, well, Bob, these are great stories and they're compelling, but are they really global? Are they really everywhere? And here's what I would say to you. What you see in the news is true. There is all kinds of conflict, and there is reason for us to be deeply concerned about the condition of the social fabric of society in terms of race, in terms of healthcare, in terms of the coronavirus, in terms of the climate, in terms of the justice and equity of our institutions. All those things are true. But there is another reality. We are in a process of chaotically moving from a lower level of order to a higher level of order. And everywhere in the world, the things that I'm saying are true and demonstrable. So what does this mean for us? One, that we become learners, that we adopt and hold ourselves accountable to this principle of the independent investigation of truth. Because we've got to kind of look for ourselves or we'll miss these things. If our sources are the television and the news and our friends, we're likely to get part of the story, but not all of the story. The second is that we've got to be comfortable with paradox. It can be simultaneously true that bad things are happening and at the same time, good things are happening. And we've got to equip ourselves to help those positive forces of change and transformation to accelerate, to take hold, and to do their work. These are essentially the ideas of the Baha'i faith. So I'll tell you one last story, and then we'll open it up, and we can have questions and answers and discussion. I was invited to the White House during the Clinton administration, and I was I had been there before to give a talk in a small conference that President Clinton held on race. And I was invited back for breakfast with the president and a very small number of other people. 28 people were in the room. And I was quite amazed, kind of wondering how I got invited and what they wanted from me. And when you go to the White House, where you sit is not accidental. You don't just grab a chair and start eating breakfast. Somebody tells you, you sit over here. And I found myself at the table with the president, and I was quite amazed. And at a certain point, one of the secretaries in the president's cabinet turned to me and said, "You're probably wondering why you were invited here today." And I said, "Yeah, absolutely. I am totally befuddled. I'm happy to be here. It's wonderful to hear all this stuff, but yeah, if you want to shed some light on this, I would love to hear it." He said, "President Clinton and I have been all over the world. We've met with Africans, with South Americans, with Asians. We've been everywhere." And he said, "Everywhere we go, we find that the center of the most productive social and economic development are the Baha'is." And he said, "We asked ourselves, why is that? Why is it that in Mozambique or Costa Rica or this place or that place, everywhere we go, the Baha'is are in the middle of some of the best things happening in those countries?" And he said that we finally concluded that it has to do with your approach to social and economic development. He said, "I think that what you call it is the spiritual process of consultation." But he said, as far as we've been thinking about it, we see that the importance of it is that it gets everybody involved. It gives everyone a voice. But it gives them a voice in the context of a shared purpose. We want to solve a fundamental problem that is common to all of us. And this process creates understanding, it creates cooperation, and ultimately it creates a united commitment to the solving of these problems. And so what we find is Baha'is are the first to leave, so the first to come and the last to leave, and they never take the money, and they like everybody and want everybody involved. And he said, we're trying to get the same things to happen in our relationships with Congress and with the Senate, so that we can pass legislation more effectively. And so what he asked me, he said, we asked you here this morning so that you could go and retrieve all of the Baha'i principles related to social and economic development and send them to the president, because we want to use these principles in order to solve problems. And here are the two problems that they wanted to solve. The first problem was they wanted debt forgiveness to every nation that had been led by a dictator, but had thrown off the yoke of dictatorship and elected a democratically elected government. And their reasoning was very simple. They said that by the time these nations elect a democracy, they're so mired in debt that they can't enjoy the benefits of democracy. So what we'd like to do is we'd like to have a program that says, if you spend the money you owe us on healthcare, education, and agriculture, then we will forgive your debt. And we know that everybody would be agreed with this in principle, but we want to use this Baha'i process of consultation to really gain support and understanding. I'm happy to tell you that right now, A, they got that law passed, and B, 47 nations around the world have benefited from this debt forgiveness. as a direct result of the application of this principle. So, you know, here we see ourselves as virtually invisible, and we don't think of ourselves as necessarily having any influence, but we have no idea how these efforts in local communities all over the world are being perceived by others, and how they are having a transforming effect on the shaping of policy and legislation and the like. So I've wandered on way too long, but what I've tried to do is kind of give you a sense that the world is not simply drifting in a downward spiral. Some of you have thought it's not drifting, it's accelerating in a downward spiral. But that in fact, this chaotic process of transformation is moving from a world order that no longer meets the needs of human beings in terms of poverty, in terms of healthcare, in terms of education, in terms of human equality, in terms of justice, in terms of social organization. But out of that is emerging small, invisible little efforts that are having a transformational effect all over the world. And a transformational effect on the very biggest and most important problems that humankind faces. So I've taxed your patience way too long. I apologize for that. But as you can imagine, these aren't neat little stories that are easily told or easily summarized. They're complicated realities that are sometimes hard to believe and difficult to describe. So Vafa, with your permission, we'll just kind of open it up, and if there are any questions or comments.
Yes, thank you very much. And first of all, I want to thank you so much for sharing your insights, sharing the stories, the principles that are driving those stories, and especially the examples that you showed us. Because very often, as we make these transitions from lower orders to higher orders, for many they can seem daunting, for many they can seem overwhelming, but when we share very specific examples of how they are working in that transformation, it makes it that much more palatable, enjoyable, understandable, and easier to embrace. So friends, we're going to open it up to questions, but what I would like to do, because there are so many participants, I would appreciate it if you would use the hand feature and put up your digital hand so that we can see it, and we will go through those that would like to ask some questions. Please also feel free to put in your question in the chat box. We'll make sure we get to that. And while you're figuring all of that down, perhaps I can start with a question, and that will give everybody the time to kind of formulate your questions and put up your digital hand. One of the things that you talked about, Dr. Henderson, early.
Vafa.
Yes.
Bob.
Sorry. Okay. That's a little hard for me, but all right, Bob.
Yeah, work with it. You can say it backwards, I'll still get it.
All right. So, Bob, one of the, I think you can appreciate it's a little hard for me. But, Bob, one of the things that you talked about early was the complexity of the chaotic nature of the transition and transformation. And you also touched on this notion of leadership and what leadership means. And what I wanted to ask is, you know, with the challenges we're having with leadership today, how do you see the role of leadership in this transition, in this transformation from the lower order to the higher order? Because the way you described it as kind of the influence over others and the impact we have on others, as opposed to a position of authority, rank, or so on. What's the relationship between how you describe leadership and this notion of transition and transformation when we see that it can be quite chaotic?
You know, leadership is an interesting paradox because, you know, when things are unstable, human beings want safety. They want stability and they want control. And there's nothing safer, more stable, or more controlling than being the boss. And so what happens is lots of leaders do good things, and that's how they become leaders. And when they become leaders, they succumb to this desire to be the boss and to control things. But that's not the kind of leadership that I'm talking about. And every one of the examples that I gave you is characterized by a different kind of leadership. And the leadership that it's characterized is as the leader as a servant leader, that is a leader in service to others. So, and this is a fundamental, it's a big discussion in leadership. It's a big discussion in organizations. But the idea of servant leadership is fundamental, that we lead by example, that our primary concern is the well-being and the promotion of the well-being of other people, of the organization, of the community, of the solution to problems. And so leaders emerge not because of their quest for power, but because of their commitment to the service of others. And as a result, that leadership that is characterized as servant leadership tends to foster trust, it fosters confidence, and it fosters cooperation, because you tend to believe that the leader, be it a child, a woman, or a boy or a man, is more committed to the benefits that all of us will acquire and to helping that process than they are to getting something for me and making sure that my position is safe and that I'm in power. Let me just give you a simple example. One of the concerns that we all have, especially in Canada and the United States, is the amount of money that the middle class no longer has. You know, when you were all young, a person on a moderate income could buy a house. That is very difficult to do now. So you say, well, gee, for crying out loud, we're richer than we've ever been. Where's the money going? Well, I'll tell you where the money is going. The money is going 75% of the profits of Fortune 500 companies is being spent to buy the stock of those countries, of those companies. And the reason is the leaders are paid in stock. So if you buy your own stock, the stock price goes up and you go from being a millionaire to a billionaire. Well, the problem with that is it's not being spent on wages to workers. It's not being spent on research and development. It's not being spent on new products and new services. And it has no long-term benefit, even to the corporation. It just makes the guy in charge richer today. That's the kind of leadership that we're most familiar with. What's in it for me? How do I benefit? We're talking about leadership that is, how do we all meet the challenges that we're confronted with? And how do we work together to better understand them, to cooperate, and to solve the problems that are related to those challenges so that we can be happy and so that we can live safe, healthy, and dignified lives.
Great, thank you. There was a comment in the chat box that I wanted to share with you and see if you'd like to provide some insights on it. And this had to do with the information and the insights you shared with us about the general improvement in the condition of the world in terms of the economic well-being, in terms of education, in terms of health, and so on and so forth. And one of the participants wrote, "The claim that we are making wonderful progress against global poverty is a fallacy based on a colonial mindset." So I wondered if you'd like to comment on that.
Yeah. So that is a very difficult thing to believe. It is understandable that anybody would say, wait a minute, what are you talking about? So I won't give you one source. I'll give you three. The first that I would commend to your consideration is the World Bank. And the reason that I would give you the World Bank is that they are funding most of what's being done. The second that I would give you is the United Nations Poverty Mitigation Program. And the third, which is probably the easiest to refer to and pulls together all of those resources, is a organization called gapminder.com. And Gapminder is the brainchild of Hans Rosling, who wrote the book called Factfulness. This book was described by Bill Gates as the most important book of the 20th century. And it is Rosling's mission. He was a medical doctor and became a statistician. His mission was to help us understand that most of what we believe about the condition of the world simply isn't factful. It simply isn't true. So there are, this is far from a colonial mindset. Let's look at the data. And not just the data from one source. Let's look at the data from lots of sources. Now, in the process, let's talk about colonialism, and let's talk about what it was and what it's becoming. Everybody who is concerned about colonialism would be concerned about big oil, because the whole idea is big oil comes and it steals your minerals. The people who live there don't get any of the benefits. All the wealth goes out of the country. So let's talk about ExxonMobil. And let me describe for you what ExxonMobil is doing in West Africa. ExxonMobil is one of the primary drivers of the rise of civil society in West Africa. And the reason is that they realize that without a stable population, they can't build any industry in that area. So they are the primary builder of schools. They're the primary builder of housing. They are the primary builder of hospitals and libraries and the like, because of a growing understanding. And this is not that they don't want to make money. What's happening in business is people are beginning to realize that the idea of a strategy, which is, oil's over there and I've got machine and technology to go get it, is dead. And what's changing what's killing it is communications technology and the speed of change. So the question that's being asked by leading thinkers and by big corporations is, if strategy is dead, what replaces it? And the answer that people are coming to is a spiritually galvanizing sense of purpose. That is, everybody's got to be involved, everybody's got to have a seat at the table. Well, when that happens, what also happens is the kind of leadership changes, and it goes from leadership as boss to leadership as facilitator, as educator, as coordinator. And it also changes the relationship of the company to the community. And it changes it from being just a financial entity to being a social entity. Because like the Exxon example, what you realize is, I can't operate unless I cooperate with the community in which I'm functioning. So I can well understand that this could be seen as a colonialist mindset, but the facts just don't say that. The facts are different than that.
Great, thank you. Another question that's from the chat line is, based on the statistics, the data, the extreme decreases in poverty and violence and women's education, etc., why do you think there seems to be a general false perception that the opposite is true? Is it perhaps because of the media's influence?
Well, because if you go to any of the sources that I mentioned, United Nations, World Bank, or Gapminder, one of the things that you'll find is that they have a wonderful game they play, and it's this very same game that we played. How many of you think this, and how many of you think that? Well, when they do it with the media, and they ask the media some of the same questions that I asked you, they get them wrong.
Right.
9% of the media knows. So the stories you hear are the stories that make the headlines. And they tend to be the stories of big explosions and big conflicts and big collapses and big betrayals of trust. But those little stories of people making change in the quality of life. I mean, for example, one of the stories that I'd love to tell is the story of how they changed climate in Somalia. Because the Somali farmers had torn down all the trees in order to grow more crops. And when they did that, they had floods, they had droughts, and they had less crops. What the World Bank did was it showed the farmers an education process. And what they did was they showed satellite pictures to the farmers of what the land used to look like and what it used to harvest and what it looks like now. And then they helped the farmers learn that to grow back the trees would actually increase the rains, retain the water, and produce more crops. And literally 10 years later, they had been able to transform the climate, reduce drought, reduce flooding, and increase increase arable land and crop harvests. So I mean, these things are real. That's the story I'd love for the media to tell, but you don't see that story. What you see is some neighborhood collision in Somalia where there's rioting. Well, yeah, that's true. But it is also true that farmers are producing more food, that less drought. Look, how many people understand that the human rights violations in Syria are all directly related to climate change? The collapse of the Syrian government is the direct result of droughts in Syria that drove people to the cities, that overwhelmed the cities, that caused all of the mess that we've seen. But that's not the story you hear. What you see is Assad is bombing his own people. Well, yeah, that's true. But there is a bigger set of issues to solve in order to stop that bombing.
Yeah, indeed. And that's one of the challenges, I think, of our times, is that we're listening to and dealing with issues at the level of the surface, at the level of mechanics, as opposed to trying to understand what the root cause is, and can we therefore create a transformation that's sustainable and we can address those
Look,
things.
if you went back to the first story I told about the Bahia Vista school,
Right.
The answer was, get these kids out of my school and I'll be happy.
Right.
The better answer is, let's figure out a way for all of them to unite,
Right.
to know each other and so forth. And what you get is a smarter kid who's multilingual, who can talk to anybody in the world, and who's not afraid of people who are different than them.
Right. Indeed. We have a hand up, Mariam. It says Mariam's iPhone. I'm sure that's not her last name, but I know Mariam is her first name. So Mariam, if you'd like to go ahead and ask your question, please.
Thank you. I just wanted to say thank you, Mr. Henderson. That was extremely hopeful, and I'm so thankful to have been able to participate. My question. Oh, sorry. Hello?
Yeah, go ahead, Mariam.
Sorry. Did you hear me up to now or no?
Yeah.
No,
okay,
go ahead.
Sorry. Okay, sorry. So my question has to do with your perspective on what perhaps falsely I see as an increase in the levels of conflict, ethnic conflict, conflict in nation states that has caused them to fall apart. So, you know, the breakup of Yugoslavia, the breakup of what was the Soviet Union, and all the conflict that created, and the fact that we now live in a world that is apparently much more conflict ridden, and conflict ridden than, and post conflict ridden, than, as you were saying, the world that I was born in. And so what your comment is on that, and what your perspective is on that. Yeah, that's my question.
All right, so let me first establish a point of reference, because I said the world is safer than it used to be by a lot. In fact, scientists who study this stuff say that it's safer than it has ever been in human history. The definitive book on this is called The Better Angels of Our Nature. It is written by a Harvard social psychologist, Steven Pinker, and it is 942 pages. And the reason, and he says at the beginning of the book, the reason this book is so long is that you're not going to believe what I have to say. And then he goes on to prove what's happening. So here's the point, Mariam. First of all, you're right about conflict zones and post-conflict zones. There's no question about that. And we can see on television where conflict is happening, and we can see it almost instantly. At the very same time, it is not the only reality. Significant other and constructive developmental activities are going on at the same time. And they are being aided by some forces that have become global shapers of a new civil society. For example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights works. And more countries are being held accountable to those standards and are changing the way they treat their people and treat other people in accordance with those standards. The systematic effort to wipe out disease worked. It worked with AIDS in Africa, it's worked with polio, it's worked with so many other things. It's now we're seeing cooperative efforts among the nations on COVID, and all of that's going to happen. All of that is working with the same dynamics. The global effort to educate women has worked, and that's one of the reasons why infant mortality is 75% lower than it was 20 years ago, because women now have more knowledge and more tools to make sure that their kids are vaccinated and this and that and the other. And all those things are reducing despair, which in turn reduces conflict. So, and creates an opportunity for people to work, to save, and so on. And those statistics are jaw-dropping. When you read those stories and you begin to understand the data, you hit yourself in the head and you say, why didn't I know this? How could I have not known this? But that data is available. So if you looked at The Better Angels of Our Nature, all 942 pages, one of the things you'll see is that there is a new consciousness emerging that is shaping the way human beings relate to one another. And that consciousness and the laws and the policies that are its offspring are changing the way we relate to each other and dramatically reducing the kind of violence that has been routine in the past.
Great, thank you.
That's the reference.
I appreciate that. One quick question before I move on to the next one. The management book that you mentioned regarding the acceleration of change, the question is, what is the title of that book? If you can.
I referenced a book that Peter Drucker wrote
Right.
late in his life. It's called Post-Capitalist Society. And basically what it's about is the knowledge society.
Right.
And what it means is knowledge is now more important than money.
Got it. Thank you. If I can go to a question there's a lot of questions here. So I'd like to go to a question by Stan. Stan says, what are Bob's thoughts regarding societies that are, in society we're moving backward into an oligarchy system where, the super rich are controlling the levers of future development?
No, let me ask Bob. Actually, I think that this is a bad development and a good development at the same time. It's a bad development because it confronts us with challenges of populist dictators and oligarchs and people who want to keep things the way they were, primarily for the benefit of themselves and their friends. It is a good development in the sense that the pressure of change is causing them to become more obvious and more active. And what we're seeing, not just in the United States and Canada, but all over the world, is that ordinary people are pushing back and saying that's not what we want to do. We want change. We want our institutions to function in a different way, and so on. And so there is a phrase in one of the letters of the Baha'i faith written by Shoghi Effendi, who was the guardian of the Baha'i faith for many decades. And he talks about this process of the last gasp of the old order trying to hold on to the way things have always been and trying to resist the move to the future. And he says, behold the confusion that has befallen the tribes of the defeated. And what he's referring to is, as much as you try to hold on to yesterday, the sun of tomorrow is going to rise anyway. So for example, in one of his letters, written in 1928, he's arguing for the establishment of the European Union, which was a big discussion at that time. And what he says is that the opponents of the European Union, now this is 1928, the opponents of the European Union are locked in an outmoded way of thinking about what truly benefits their nation and what truly benefits their world. And that the greatest benefit they could, their nations could have, is to join with other nations in a kind of United States of Europe, and then to become a United States of the world, thereby assuring the collective security of all people of all nations, and stimulating the kind of cooperation and the kind of problem solving that enhances the wealth and the prosperity and the well-being and the education of all people. So those are Bob's thoughts.
Thank you. One of the friends, Deborah, is referring to the point you made about the global population, 10 billion, 11 billion. And there's a sense of anxiety around how do we deal with that as a global community. And then the second part is, great question, what does life in the middle look like if you still can't buy a home?
Well, it depends on which middle you're talking about. Because if we're talking about the middle that I talked about, I said that 85% of the world's population used to be in extreme poverty, and now only 9% of it is. Now that's still a billion people. So it's still a major problem, and it still has awful consequences. But it also tells us that the things that we're doing to mitigate poverty are working, and that we need to do more of that in order to improve the collective condition of more people. Well, a lot of the, if we go back to this principle of the oneness of humankind, that would, if I truly believed that all of us have equal human value, then I wouldn't make a deal that makes me rich and keeps you poor. That wouldn't be. In fact, I had a client. At United Technologies, and this man was the chief executive of a huge portion of United Technologies. And what they did was they made all of the copper wire that is everywhere. So all the copper wire in your house, in your electrical cords, and that runs everything. And when I asked him what he did for a living, because my job was to assess him as chief executive, is he doing a good job or not a good job? When I said, well, Jim, what do you do? He didn't say anything about wire. He said, Bob, we build communities. That's what he said. He said, we heat your church, we light your hospital, we make it warm for your kids to go to school. He said, I lit Beijing. He said, Mexico City has light because our factories made the wire. And I said, well, how is it you've got over 100,000 guys working for you? And you tell me you haven't had layoffs in 25 years, and that's unheard of. In manufacturing, if times are bad, you lay people off and cut costs. How is it that you've been able to maintain a stable workforce? And he said, look, if I was in the wire business, then I would just cut costs. But that's not the business I told you I'm in. I'm in the community building business. And so he said, it's important that the communities that help us do that work are stable. So he said, I said, well, how do you do it? How do you keep from laying these guys off? He said, well, it's easy. In the summertime, we stack nuts. And in the wintertime, we eat nuts. So when times are plenty, they gather all their resources and they invest them wisely and they save. And when times are rough, they use those resources to maintain the continuity of employment of their folks. And when you're talking about 125,000 people, that's a lot of communities. So that's the difference in thinking about using this principle of the oneness of humankind, because if I'm thinking about the collective well-being of the community, then the kinds of decisions I make and the kinds of policies that guide me are fundamentally different than if I'm just thinking about shareholder value. Now, long term, his company makes more money for the shareholders than anybody else's because there aren't these jagged ups and downs. But short term, you can make a lot of money if you just take all the cash and give it as dividends and buy your own stock. But then later, you can't refurbish your factories, and you've got to lay a lot of people off. So that's the difference. That principle of the oneness of humankind has practical expressions, and it leads to a different kind of thinking and a different kind of human value and a different kind of decision making.
Indeed, and it seems to me that sometimes what happens is we can, even though we may have a great purpose and we start the journey, as you get distant from that central point of purpose, it's easy to fall back to our comfort zones or to our old habits and so on. So it's so important to continuously make sure that you're connecting and referring and calibrating back to that original purpose and asking the questions, are we still aligned? Are we still coherent? Are we still united in this common purpose? And those checkpoints that we have. I really like this notion that you talked about how leaders and leadership can make decisions and give back. I was very impressed by someone you may know, because I think is in your hometown, Ed Bastian, who's the CEO of Delta Airlines. Back in February on Valentine's Day, he gave $1.6 billion. He distributed $1.6 billion amongst all of the employees of the organization. And that, I don't think at the time he knew that COVID was going to come and hit the way that it did. But there's many examples of leaders that can make great decisions.
I'll give you an example with one of my clients. These guys are the top of their industry. They are the global leader and acknowledged as such, and they are at the very top of the Fortune 100 list of best companies to work for. I mean, these guys are terrific. When the '08 crisis hit, and nobody knew if we were going to have money tomorrow or we were not, we're spiraling out of the chief executive made a video for the 60,000 employees they had in 100 different places. And what he said to them was, we don't know what tomorrow brings. We don't know if we're going to come back from this or if the whole economy is going to crash and burn. But here's what we know. He said, we know that your family is as important to you as my family is to me. So we have dug into our reserves, and we are going to assure that every single one of our employees remains fully employed at 100% of your compensation level, even if it cuts our profits this year. And he was weeping while he made this video. Now, that's a different kind of leadership than the leadership that says, we're not making money, you got to go. He says, your family is as important to you as my family is to me. So we're going to use our reserves to keep you employed so that you can take care of your family. That's the kind of leadership I'm talking about. And that is, and frankly, I'm not sure that same person would have said that before some change and some growth and development.
Yes. Great, thank you.
Here is a question from one of the participants. How do we combat the forces that are causing the crumbling of many aspects of society? Whether it's our politics, the social order, the media, our economics, etc.
Here's one way to think about that. There is an agency called the National Information Council. And what it does is it is the super advisory agency to the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency in the United States. And every 5 years, the National Intelligence Council delivers a report that says, here are the main problems that face the United States in the next 5 years. These are the big strategic issues. And Saeed, the last report they gave spoke specifically to your question. Because what they said was that the main challenge that the United States and the world would face is that politics, social organization, and the forces of social change will become more localized and less national. And so they said, for example, in the United States, the person who would have the greatest amount of power would be the mayors of big cities, because they have a direct relationship with a specific constituency. And that within those cities, organized groups of people who could attract attention and attract cooperation and would be able to make profound changes that would catch on and multiply throughout countries. So to your point, it is true that there are these big global problems that affect whole populations and whole countries. But it is also true that on a global basis, power is more in the control of local entities. So let me give you an example. I worked on a project to build a fiber optic broadband cable from France to Cape Town, South Africa, down the west coast of Africa. And the idea was to connect Africa to the World Wide Web because it was not connected. And then to drive it to schools and universities and this and that and the other. And the problem was that we had 26 countries involved in trying to get this thing built. And we're trying to get everybody to cooperate. But I wanted it for my country, but I wanted to make sure your country didn't get it. And Vafa's country and other countries, you know, give it to me, but make sure nobody else gets it. And so I'm having this conversation, and I'm consulting with these guys, and I'm trying to get some collective understanding that the benefit of all the countries would benefit Africa as a whole, and all of them would improve. So most of the national representatives, we had 26 national delegations, and these 26 national delegations are trying to figure out how to build the cable, who gets the money, where the cable goes, how it's made, and all this other stuff. And most of them were Muslims. They were from Muslim countries because it's West Africa. So they're Muslims or they're Christians. So we would meet for 8 days every month, morning, noon, and night, 8 days. And we'd either meet in Paris because everybody could get there, or someplace in Africa. And so since they were Muslims, we would have these long lunches, and they would talk about Islam. And every now and again, I'd just throw something out, just a little comment under my breath, because they thought that anybody from the West didn't know anything about Islam. And I could see eyebrows rising and so on. So one day I went to get some tea, and they sent a guy after me, and he says, "Bob, a few of us were wondering, what is your book?" And what he meant by that was, "What religion do you follow?" And I said, "Well, I follow Baha'u'llah, I'm a Baha'i." And so we go back to this table, long table, and he clicks his thing, and he says, "I've talked to Bob, and he's a Baha'i." And I don't know how this is going to go. I mean, it's just, I am very interested. And to my amazement, everybody says, "Baha'i?" And every one of the nations starts talking about how the Baha'is were the center point of educating kids and promoting the role of women and doing things with junior youth and having youth groups and improvement projects in the cities and the villages, and how they loved everybody and they hated no one, and so on. And it became a rallying point. It was one of the few things we all agreed on. So, you know, here are these Baha'is, and they're invisible as far as they're concerned. They're just going about with junior youth groups and children's classes and trying to have meaningful conversations and devotional meetings and trying to bring people together for service projects and so forth. And they think they're having no effect at all. And yet the unifying effect they had in Senegal and Paris and wherever we were meeting, everybody got excited because they knew that the Baha'is had love in their hearts, were true servant leaders committed to the well-being of everyone, and could bring about change. The result was we were able to build the fiber optic broadband cable, and the most difficult thing that I wanted to do got done, and that is I wanted to give away broadband connectivity to universities, schools, hospitals, libraries, and social service organizations because A, they couldn't pay for it, they didn't have any money. And B, I argued that if the cable was implemented, rich people would get richer, but poor people would stay poorer, unless you had a way to even the playing field by boosting education, boosting health, boosting social cooperation. And that was, and in the end, they thought that I had figured out a way to steal. You know, there must be a clever plan here somewhere, and you just figured out a way to make this look good, but you're really going to steal the money. But at the end of the day, we were able to establish the broadband philanthropy, and now kids have school in remote villages by computer. Libraries and hospitals have connectivity, and universities, where a whole university of 40, 50,000 people would have the same amount of broadband connectivity that you have in your house for 40,000 people. they'd have the same that you enjoy every day by yourself. So they couldn't have conferences, they couldn't, they couldn't have email correspondence with other scholars and so forth. Now they do, and they have it for free. So, to your point, yes, it is true that whole societies and populations are being victimized. At the same time, there are these other forces that are having a transformational effect on the quality of life of whole populations and whole systems of countries.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Bob. I mean, it's really interesting. As I'm thinking about all the content that we have shared, there seems no question that the transformation that we need not only can take place, but there are, from this lower order to the higher order, but there are ample examples of ways and means by which we can begin that journey. What Germain, from my perspective, as I understand it, is it really does begin with the principles that we are trying to demonstrate and have manifest in our design, in our execution, in our construct, etc. And also the extent to which we all get involved and engaged in that process, that it becomes an active exercise rather than a passive. So we must become active participants rather than passive recipients. Mm-hmm. So that we can demonstrate these principles at work and have that spirit of, as you said, independent investigation of truth, that we're all in this journey together. That diversity of perspective can help foster the unity that's necessary.
And make us smarter.
And
make us smarter.
And make us smarter, and therefore better decisions, and so on and so forth. So I really want to thank you. I know we took a big chunk of your time. I want to thank you especially for taking the time to spend this evening with us. I want to thank all the friends that participated. I know there are friends from across the United States. I know there are friends from across Canada. I also know that we have Hong Kong on the fireside. We also have Jordan on the fireside. I'm sure I'm missing some other country other than the United States and Canada. But thank you everybody for participating and sharing this time, your Sunday evening, Sunday afternoon, Monday morning, whatever time zone you are. Thank you so much for participating. For those that may not know, this is an opt-in participation. So if you would like to be part of the distribution list for future firesides, what you need to do is either send me an email. I just put my email in the chat box. Feel free to send me an email, and I'm happy to put you on there, or stay in contact with the person that invited you, and they will let you know they're likely someone on the list. Again, thank you very much, Dr. Robert Henderson, Bob. It was a pleasure to have this fireside with you, and thank you everybody for participating. Everyone, please stay safe, please stay healthy, and please engage in the process of learning and transformation. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.